Hey, give me a listen. Your corpses appear, crystals of you. You still got an ear. I'll tell you a story, make a skeleton cry. Of our own jubiliciously lovely corpse bride. You might try high, you might try brave, but you all end up the remains of the day. Well, there was a beauty mountain for miles around. He was still a stream. She came into town. He's plenty good looking, with diamonds cash. And I wanted a baby, she fell hard and fast. But her daddy said no, she just couldn't cope. So our lovers came up with a plan to elope. All end up the nation. Oh yeah, come on boys, do that. Okay, Charles, do
Salutations, ghouls and freaks. Welcome to Podcast of Storm, where insane slashers, undead blood drinkers, and all-around crooked beans convene to talk and debate all things pop culture. With me, as always, is my co-host, the Mage of Madness, aka the Authenticator, Dalton L. Mortimer.
Hello, folks, and happy Halloween preemptively.
And I am your scarecrow impersonator / host, the Brainstormer of Pop Culture. How's everyone doing tonight?
Tired, mostly because you spent like the last half an hour yawning.
Well, we have a very marginally. It's just pretty much the same as last week, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
We got some stupid stuff, we got some cool stuff, and everything else in between.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay, so give me a second to post this up. This is from Pinterest. Pinterest inspires a less stereotypical Halloween while raising awareness around cultural sensitivity. This is published October 1st, 2020. I'm not entirely sure who the author was. Dalton, I believe you had sent this to me, correct?
Yes, I did, because, well, you'll see why in a minute. It's yet another in the long line of attempts to co-opt and sanitize Halloween for abstract moral woo-woo reasons. Because we can't have nice things, apparently. Nice things are immoral, according to the dominant zeitgeist.
Right. Okay, so every year, millions of people come to Pinterest for Halloween inspiration, and even though this year looks different, searches related to the holiday continue to rise as people plan for their unique Halloweens. Costumes are consistently a top search term, but many people may not know that certain costumes are appropriations of other cultures. I'll be honest, the first part of the title, less stereotypical, my mind thought of the more, like my mind just kind of went to the kind of, stereotypical, like just the kind of basic stuff they kind of get every year, the cookie cutter Halloween. So.
Yeah, vampires, werewolves, ghosts, witches, yada, yada, yada. But no, it didn't. It meant, I guess Pinterest meant less stereotypical in the sense that you can't dress as an Indian chief or as a geisha or as, I don't even know, a voodoo priest or something. That would qualify as stereotyping and cultural appropriation. Never mind that most people who dress in those kind of outfits either dress that way because there's something they find interesting and compelling about that particular stereotype, or they're mocking the stupidity of the stereotype itself, which does happen.
It's actually funny you bring up voodoo priest stuff because I actually have a voodoo priest hat right now.
Yes, I remember. You got it last year.
Yeah. All right. So moving forward, as a platform for positivity, we wanted to make it easy to find culturally appropriate Halloween ideas and bring awareness to the fact that costumes should not be opportunities to turn a person's identity into a stereotyped image. Hey, look, if Dalton wants to wear a sombrero with a poncho, I ain't going to stop him. Mainly because seeing him in that is honestly just too funny. And the fact that it's funny on the fact that I've never seen a single person wear something like that.
I honestly should one of these times get all dolled up in like a Day of the Dead outfit just for the lulz.
See, now that's racist.
Oh, heck, you started it.
I can't dress like a white guy. I'd just be dressing as myself. Seriously, dude. White people are kind of bland. Let's be honest.
Well, it depends upon the culture of the white person. And incidentally, that's another quagmire in this. White people, okay, have multiple different cultures. But I don't see you saying, like, you shouldn't dress as a leprechaun on St. Patrick's Day because that's offensive to Irish people. For some reason, this only seems to apply when it's people of different races. Because in your mind, you seem to conflate people of different races with either ultra victimized for some abstract historical reason, or so fragile that they need to be protected. And also, does this mean that those of us that practice occultism can veto anyone dressing up as a witch all of a sudden? Because I very much doubt that. I very much doubt that if I even tried to voice that objection, everyone under the sun would laugh at me. Well, Pinterest, that's what happens to normal people when you say shit like this. Because again, usually when someone dresses as, I don't know, a stereotypical lazy Mexican with a sombrero and shit, it's either to mock the stereotype or it's an exaggeration of that person in order to represent that they actually find something compelling and interesting about that culture. Moving forward, though.
Did you have to add the lazy part?
That's the stereotype. I'm sorry. That's what Mexicans are stereotyped as. Just like Irish people are stereotyped as drunks.
You do, German. Dude. You do realize I'm part Mexican and part Irish, right?
Yes, that was why I made that.
Now I'm double offended, you racist bastard.
Well, I will have to just find my copy of The World's Smallest Violin and play myself to sleep with it.
Right, okay. Next part of it is cultures aren't costumes. Halloween should be a time for inspiration, not a time for insensitivity. It's why since 2016 we prohibited advertisements with culturally inappropriate costumes and make it possible for pinners to report culturally insensitive content right from pins. Congratulations, you're a fucking tyrannical bitch.
Also, by whose definition of culturally insensitive and by what criteria are you making that determination? I ask this because some people, like myself, when we bother to get dressed up for things like Halloween, we do a fuck ton of research on our costume. You should see the level of detail I put into just my Phantom of the Opera costume the last time I dressed up for a Halloween party. But my point being, where exactly is the line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation? Like, for example, there are college students who study things like cultural anthropology and who specialize in various cultures. Are you telling me that if I was a Asian studies student and I decided to go as a geisha or sumo or something like that, or maybe a figure from Chinese mythology, I don't know, I don't fucking care. It's not really immaterial to the point. Are you saying that you would call them culturally insensitive? Or if you were, say, an African studies person and you decided to go as a tribal king or a figure, like let's say somebody who studied African culture wanted to go as a Nazi the Spider for Halloween. Are you going to honestly tell me that their costume was offensive? Because honestly, the only aspect of this whole rigmarole that I can actually get behind is people should put more thought into their costume. You shouldn't just go with the most cartoonish, over-the-top, simplistic version of a thing when you go with that thing. You should put in a little bit more effort. But my objection to that is the lack of effort. Your objection to that is you're worried that you will somehow offend some racial hive mind or some cultural hive mind. And need I remind you once again, people of certain identities don't all think the same. There isn't some cultural hive mind. You're not going to offend every Romani person ever by going as a gypsy fortune teller for Halloween. You're not going to offend every Romanian or every Transylvanian ever by going as Dracula for Halloween. Even though, if you actually look into East European like folklore and culture, they actually consider Vlad Dracula Tepes a folk hero because he defended his country from Turkish invaders during the Crusades. Basically, everywhere else in the world, Dracula may be considered a vampire, but you actually go to somewhere like Romania or Transylvania, and they will probably look sideways at you if you only know Dracula as a vampire. To them, he's an actual historical figure that actually matters. But you wouldn't ban everyone from dressing as Dracula, would you? No, because for some reason that culture can get fucked and every other culture gets special treatment because something historical oppression narrative. But if you wouldn't avoid going as Dracula to avoid offending Eastern Europeans, and you wouldn't avoid going as a Viking to avoid offending people from Scandinavia, then why exactly the fuck do we have to refrain from going as stereotypical Native American chieftains to avoid offending Native American people, or African chieftains to avoid offending Black people, even if they put the knowledge and expertise into that costume, which is my solution. My solution to this whole problem would be put more effort into your costume and put more effort into doing research if you go as a thing. Your solution would just be to ban every fucking thing. I prefer my solution. I get that it's my solution. I would prefer it, but appreciation is better than banning. And if you have such a problem with appropriation, then define the line between appropriation and appreciation, you stupid fuck. Hint: focus on meritocracy and not historical oppression narratives. It'll do wonders for you. Moving on.
Right. Okay. Starting this year, certain searches, like for Day of the Dead costumes, will show a pin at the top results with information curated by Pinterest employee group Pin Indigenous and experts like, huh?
Indigenous.
Pindigenous. God, that's fucking stupid. And experts like Dr. Adrienne Keene on how to celebrate thoughtfully and respectively. Motherfucker, do you not know what Day of the Dead is?
Of course. Well, I don't want to say they don't know, because that would be straw manning. But
well, I'm just saying. I'm saying. Obviously, okay. Let me just make sure. Day of the Dead, which comes after Halloween, on November 1st.
And 2nd, yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. Is the celebration and show respect to those that have passed away. It is nothing but a time to celebrate thoughtfully and respectively, but not in the terms you're defining them as. More in the I would assume classical general terms of thoughtfully and respectively.
Yeah. And just to point out the clear hypocrisy here, just imagine a universe where anyone who isn't Hispanic or Mexican or whatever, anyone who isn't those things avoids talking about Day of the Dead ever. I would bet, I would stake my reputation on the fact that in a universe where anyone who wasn't Hispanic or of Hispanic descent was forbidden from talking about Day of the Dead ever, some asshole would be writing an article about how the fact that we never talk about Day of the Dead proves that Mexican people are oppressed and that Day of the Dead should be talked about more. And quite frankly, I would be more on that person's side. Because you want to know the reason why Day of the Dead has become a popular Halloween sort of subculture? It's because a bunch of people found out what Day of the Dead was and went, gee, that's cool, I want to be a part of that. And then proceeded to take what bits of Day of the Dead iconography they could and incorporate it into Halloween, because quite frankly, and I might get some shit for this, but Day of the Dead has always been basically the Mexican version of Halloween. Granted, there are cultural differences between the stereotypical way one celebrates Halloween and the stereotypical way someone celebrates Day of the Dead, but they're born out of the same history. They both were essentially Christian attempts to co-opt and Christianize what used to be known as Samhain or Samhain. And then it became All Hallows Day, and then it became All Saints Day. And in Mexican countries, or Hispanic countries in particular, the All Saints Day celebrations eventually morphed into ancestral and familial celebrations, which is why there's the notion of ancestors and important figures in family histories being able to come back for 2 or 3 days. It's the same logic of the veils between worlds are thin in this time period. That doesn't mean that Day of the Dead and Halloween are different, which they are, but it's not ignorant or overly simplistic to call Day of the Dead Mexican Halloween, because it is essentially that. It might be oversimplifying in the broadest sense, but in actuality, it's probably just summing things up. And if we couldn't talk about that, we wouldn't have movies like Book of Life or Coco. And that would be a travesty. The main reason why it's become popular is because people like and appreciate it as a tradition. Dumbasses. Moving on.
Additionally, we're limiting recommendations for costumes that appropriate cultures.
That was just extremely redundant. If your objection to people searching for Day of the Dead oriented Halloween costumes was that it was culturally appropriated, and then you say, and we're also banning costumes that appropriate cultures, you have just repeated yourself. Because your objection to Day of the Dead or any commingling between Halloween and Day of the Dead is cultural appropriation, then you've repeated yourself. God damn it, people. If you're going to be this stupid, can you at least be rhetorically competent while you're being that stupid? Please. Moving on.
Let Pinterest be your guide. 2020 is the year of trying new things across holidays and celebrations. Creating new traditions along the way as pinners find inspiration for inclusive and inspiring Halloween costumes. They're also searching for creative takes on Halloween during a pandemic with top trending searches including Halloween breakfast, haunted garage, Halloween piñata, or Halloween scavenger hunt.
Okay, so just so we're clear, creative and culturally inclusive celebrations of Halloween are totally fine, but don't you dare, apparently, intermix Day of the Dead and Halloween together in any way whatsoever, even though, despite being different traditions, they are from very similar roots and have very similar mythoses. Okay, I genuinely do not know what could have possibly gone through this person's mind just now. If your definition of a positive and inclusive Halloween is taking traditions from multiple sources and allowing them to intermix together and overlap with stereotypical Halloween shit, then how in all the fucks could you possibly have any issues whatsoever with Day of the Dead and Halloween mixing together? Given that A, the main reason why it's become popular is because people found out that Mexicans have their own Halloween adjacent traditions and felt the need to reincorporate them because they're awesome. And also that I dare say most Mexican people who are likely to celebrate Day of the Dead also like and celebrate Halloween. And given that those holidays are 2 or 3 days apart, and they come from similar roots, and they're celebrated by the same people, it's only natural that those 2 holidays would intermingle together. And I find it extremely hard to believe that no Mexican person or no Hispanic person has ever intermingled together their celebrations of Halloween and Day of the Dead. If you are honestly trying to sell me that concept, the concept that no Hispanic person has ever loved Halloween and Day of the Dead both equally enough to intermix them together, then you are high, sir or madam, quite frankly. Because I would do it, and I'm not even Mexican. And feel free to ask the actual Hispanic person in the chat if that seems unusual to him.
Do what you do, just don't be a jackass.
Mm-hmm. Anyway,
Like
moving on.
It's Halloween. You're supposed to dress up. Not even just because, Halloween, dress up, it's kind of tradition. But, again, I kind of have to assume that the Fae or fairies visit here, and if you're not wearing a disguise, you might have to deal with them.
Yeah, and thank you for actually bringing that up, because I didn't have to for once.
I'm superstitious, so. Plus,
Yeah.
I love dressing up in Halloween. If no one if this is your first time watching this show, I'm a huge fan of Halloween.
Yeah, there's a reason why this was our first theme month last year, because Brainstormer is over the moon on Halloween, and I honestly, Halloween is tied for my first favorite holiday with Christmas. So yeah.
Huh. Okay, that might be the second weirdest thing I know about you.
Of all the, really, that is what you find odd.
The second weirdest. I said the second weirdest.
I'm sure I'm not the only person who considers Halloween and Christmas on equal footing as far as holidays go.
Most people prefer Christmas, as far as as friends I've had.
Well, that's probably true. Never mind. Moving forward.
But no, you tying Halloween with Christmas, that is, like I said, it's the second weirdest thing I know about you. First thing is obviously you don't like sandwiches.
Yeah, I like Halloween and Christmas for different reasons. Like, Christmas is more universally appealing in that, hearth, home, all the good and splendid things about what it is to be human in the dead of winter and so on. But Halloween, I've always loved, because Halloween is the one time of year where all the weird shit that I would be interested in anyway are completely normal, and everyone doesn't look at you like you're a fucking weirdo for being it.
Okay.
Anyway, let's finish off the Pinterest article.
Yeah. Despite the pandemic, Halloween certainly isn't canceled. Pinners are getting creative while staying safe this year by turning to at-home Halloween games, searches up 10 times since last year, and decorating every room of the house, including creating a haunted mansion bathroom 3 times, or a Halloween-themed bedroom 9 times. Some are also planning to throw a backyard Halloween party, but keep it distant. Searches for Halloween costumes with masks are now a whopping 27 times greater. And to lift the spirits of the neighborhood, pioneers are shopping for front yard decorations 7 times more than last year.
I don't really have any objections to any of that. I really wish we didn't live in a time where the arbitrary bullshit of COVID restrictions got in the way of picking Halloween. But, whatever. If nothing else, this just proves that, just like back in the olden days when the Romans converted to Christianity and tried to force convert everyone else, and the Celts went, thank you, but no, if you want to take our holidays away, you can go fuck yourself. It just goes to prove that you can't stop Halloween. And I imagine something similar will happen with Christmas when that time period rolls around. You cannot fuck with people's holidays. People love their holidays. Most people don't even know why they love their holidays so much, but god damn it, human beings love their holidays.
Yep. Okay, so I guess we should just move on to our next topic, because it's really just rambling on about stuff that doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so our next topic is just a discussion of 80s horror in general. Because that is where I think horror kind of really cemented itself as a mainstay within pop culture. Granted, I would say there were certainly prior engagements that kind of put horror, like put a spotlight on horror, like Psycho and Halloween.
Mhm.
But the 80s, and this can be said for a lot of genres in terms of movies and stuff,
Mhm.
but horror really got uh, put on the map in the 80s because there were a lot of creative people giving it their all in these movies, in like these films and stuff.
With Craven, Clive Barker,
John Carpenter. Um,
uh,
let me look some stuff up. But
H.R. Geiger.
mm-hmm. uh, damn it, I'm guy who directed Aliens. I'm blanking on his name.
Ridley Scott.
Ridley Scott. Thank you. I don't know why I was going to say Ripley.
Because in Aliens, the same franchise that Ridley Scott put on the map.
Yeah, I know.
The character named Ripley.
I know that. I'm aware of that. Evil. Sam Raimi.
Yeah. Where would we be without the grooviness that is Evil Dead?
Army of Darkness. Sure did other stuff in the 80s too.
Well, yeah, but I think the franchise he's most known for, at least with regards to horror, is Evil Dead, and justifiably so.
Yeah, but it was kind of a renaissance of sorts for, like I said, many types of genres like action and sci-fi and horror too. Like you have very classics like Friday the 13th.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Hellraiser.
The Hellraiser franchise.
Halloween as well. I mean, granted, arguments can be made that the sequels. Well, okay, the Halloween came out in 1978, so I don't know. Could we call it 80s horror or?
I think we could, because the last like 1 or 2 years of a decade are sort of transition to the next one anyway.
Okay.
And the majority of the John Carpenter's Halloween movies are in the 80s. So yeah, I would call it at least primarily an 80s franchise.
Right. Not to mention like cult classics that were like single ones and not really part of a franchise. But you have The Thing, like John Carpenter's The Thing, The Lost Boys, Gremlins. Oh, The Shining was in 1980. I didn't know that.
Yeah, even though it has nothing whatsoever to do with sports, it's still an okay movie.
I thought it was produced in the 70s or 90s, not the 80s. Oh, Poltergeist, like classic Poltergeist, Little Shop of Horrors, Beetlejuice, Ghostbusters. It again, like there was just so much that came about because horror became very versatile. I mean, like you had the classic. You obviously got very much the classic horror, like the gore and stuff. But there was also like an artistry to it as well, because, like I said, like it was like for most of these stuff, everyone put in their creative chips. Didn't really try. They just went right into it. They didn't. I'm sorry. I'm losing my. But you get my point, though, right? Like,
Yeah, they knew that horror wasn't at the time a respectable genre, and they retaliated with this by basically making the best possible movies they can while embracing every pulpy, semi-comedic aspect of it they could. A lot of them.
yeah. Oh, Monster Squad, Fright Night. I'll be honest. I watched the reboot first before I watched the original. With I kind of like the reboot better.
And any last words before the angry mob showed up?
Well, I think it's mainly to do with the actors because it had a pretty stellar cast for the most part. Like it had David Tennant in it, the guy who played Chekhov in the Star Trek remake movies. It was good. He's a good actor. And Colin Farrell as the vampire. So.
Did you know the guy who played Chekhov in the Star Trek reboot movies died?
Yeah, I know. I knew that.
It's a shame because I've liked him in a lot of movies that he's been in, and he wasn't bad as Chekhov.
Right, and it's just like, yeah. So like I said, the '80s. I don't know what about the '80s that was so good. Just again, like maybe it was just like this kind of cultural renaissance of sorts, but it just stuck with the populace so much that obviously, like today, people are constantly trying to go back to the '80s and to less.
I mean, I think it was that there was up and coming talent that loved genres that weren't considered respectable at the time, like action and horror. And instead of falling in line and going, yes, sir, you're right, these movies will never be proper movies, they went, oh, horror will never be proper movies, will it? Well, fuck you! And then they made awesome movies.
It's funny because now that I think about it, while the '80s was kind of the cultural renaissance for these genres, the '90s was kind of a perfection of these genres.
Yeah,
like
because the '80s was the time when everyone was experimenting, where everyone kind of acknowledged that the old paradigms were dead, and that they were more than willing to blaze new ground. And then the '90s basically took all of the fruits of the '80s and basically just spent a decade enjoying them. The '80s did the work so the '90s could be awesome.
Yeah.
And then the 2000s happened and everything became bland and horrible.
But what I was going to say was, and the thing about like '80s horror that I don't really think you get a lot today in modern horror, which I think really should come back, is they had a theme of sorts, like something to say. I'm not saying like art has to say something, but at least it talked about things at the time that were socially relevant, like for teenagers and stuff like that. And other times they were just like overall goofy fun. They could just watch.
Yeah.
I
mean, you could make the argument that the '80s inadvertently created the internet culture that we find ourselves in today. Because I mean, how many jokes are there on the internet about all the horror movie cliches? How many horror movies, involve like the two attractive people fuck and then they get beat up by the slasher or the monster or whatever.
Yeah,
or the final girl or the bookish character that delivers all the exposition.
Right.
All of that mostly came from the '80s.
Yeah. Granted, when they did it, for the most part, like for the mainstays that really did it, they at least tried their best to not copy almost pound for pound.
Yeah, it just sort of it happened that way because the horror genre was the genre that was alive and in the air at the time.
Yeah.
So it just emerged of its own accord.
But like I said, like artistic and expression in like certain movies, like Nightmare on Elm Street, like the original one, there were a lot of creative shots and images that really stick with you now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like Freddy, who's like this ginormous, towering beast in the night, cutting the strings that he's using to control person to make them fall to their death. If anyone remembers that scene, like if you screen cap that.
Freddy is simultaneously one of the most terrifying monsters of the 80s and also in some ways the least terrifying because like there's something to be said for a creature that can invade the sanctity of your mind and your dreams. However, if you know enough to defend yourself in your dreams, Freddy becomes a little bitch.
Yeah. But it's a shame that Wes Craven never really got to work on the sequels.
I think my favorite underappreciated Wes Craven franchise is probably Wishmaster. I really wish that some of the direct-to-video movies had gotten a better budget and had been theatrical releases because at least the first 2 or 3 of the Wishmaster movies are not bad, even though all but the first one are direct-to-video. I can't imagine if they had had a better writing staff and a better budget, what Wishmaster could have been.
Right.
Especially given that Wes Craven wanted to make a Wishmaster versus the Leprechaun series, and I want that so badly. I want to go to the parallel universe where that happens just to see it.
Okay. Sorry. But what I was gonna say was, I like back to the artistic expression thing was like a lot of these movies again were very creative in terms of how they did the things they did in those movies, like music, opening credits, and just overall how they made things look. Like it felt like actual worlds you could inhabit in. And again, like that's kind of my major problem with what movies in general today are is it just feels like it's a set.
Yeah, the thing with 80s horror movies in general is they created instant classics without even necessarily trying. Whereas today, they can try everything possible to mimic a classic, like with Gus Van Sant's remake of Psycho, and for some reason it still doesn't work. Because the part of an idea that's alive, the part of it that's independent of the people making it, it's just not there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how well you can mimic an instant classic. If the energy isn't there, then the energy isn't there. Whereas when the energy is there, you can just sort of go through the motions and wind up with something freaking awesome.
Yep. Like oh god damn it. Take Hellraiser, for example, which I would say kind of kicked off that more gothic horror, otherworldly, ethereal artistry of horror movies.
Yep.
That I think you could kind of see the inklings of in like the Insidious series, but not much.
Yeah, it's a shame that all we have now are like found footage movies and like jump scare movies.
Yeah. I recently watched some clips of Hellraiser on YouTube because I was bored.
Mhm.
Um, and I watched the scene where the man is slowly reconstructing himself from being basically a puddle of goo, and like you see the skeleton and organs coming back and stuff,
Mhm.
and just the light rays that are coming off of this practical doll they have with the music and like the scream that seems inhuman but also very much human as a man is coming back from like hell.
Yeah.
It's haunting and also beautiful at the same time.
I've always enjoyed Hellraiser's version of Hell. I think if I designed the universe, that's basically how I would make
Right.
Hell.
And okay, so this is kind of like just a thing with me in terms of like a director. So I'm putting on my director hat because I haven't put that on in a very long time.
Everyone take a drink. He's doing the film language thing.
When was the last time you remember me doing it?
When we reacted to the Project Power trailer and you went into lighting.
Because it looked like a fucking movie, which you don't get of a lot of these days. This is besides the point.
Yeah.
The practical effects in the 80s horror movies were, for the most part, fantastic because they put a lot of effort and love into these things. Like the American Werewolf in London, the werewolf transformation. How much stuff they actually did to get that transformation to work was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I just brought up, the Hellraiser scene where a man is literally coming back from hell and reconstructing his entire body. It's
Or Kubrick's remake of The Fly, where the final transformation where the guy's skull literally falls apart, it's being turned into a fly skull.
right. And I get it. Practical effects can some. And don't get me wrong. Some of the practical effects in '80s movies were kind of like today. They don't look that great. They're kind of cheesy, but I think you can still respect what was done.
There's something to be said for the style and the substance of it, because there's the substance in the sense that there's actually a physical object there, but there's also the stylistic aspect, that sort of pulpy um, kitschiness that we always associate with 80s movies. You don't you don't really have much of that in modern movies. Everything is either so dull and generic or so slick and shiny. There's no living soul behind it.
And again, that's not really a knock to CGI itself, because I think some. I mean, granted, I think the '80s where they really started to pioneer CGI, like in terms of
Yeah.
like Tron and stuff.
I mean, there's a reason why people still talk about T2 and the amazing liquid metal effects there.
Yeah, but
It's funny that we still can look back on things like Jurassic Park or T2 and go, "Holy shit, that's still amazing."
right, but
I think where we went wrong is we forgot that what CGI is the best at is augmenting and refining practical effects, and the best use of practical effects can be made with a few CG touch-ups here and there. The idea of creating entire environments purely out of CG, I think, is a mistake most of the time. You need a little bit of both to make it really worthwhile.
yeah. Not to mention a lot of iconic music from the '80s, specifically like soundtracks, come from horror.
Hmm.
Like if I were to play the Halloween theme,
Everyone would know where it was from and what you were doing. Yeah.
yeah.
Same thing with Friday the 13th.
I'm not entirely sure about that one, but my major thing about 80s horror is it's so ingrained in like pop culture that you can be born and know about this stuff without ever have seen the stuff.
Yep. And this is why I consider one of my criteria for a true classic is the potential to be parodied, because a real classic you'll see parodies of long before you see the original. And when you finally see the original, you'll go, oh, this is where this moment is from.
Yeah.
I know in my case that happened to me a lot when it came to the first time I watched Silence of the Lambs, because I had seen so many parodies of Silence of the Lambs long before I watched the movie. And then when I watched it, it just made the movie even better.
Yep. So yeah, it's just and again, like the versatility of horror in the 80s compared to today. Like you had so much variety. Like you had obviously had like your typical slasher films, which were kind of like the blockbusters at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But you also had your horror comedies, again, like Evil Dead, Army of Darkness, Werewolf, American Werewolf in London, Gremlins,
Ghostbusters, even to an extent.
Yeah, Ghostbusters. And then you had like psychological thrillers, like I believe Poltergeist. Well, I'll say it's psychological for the time being because I think mainly it was kind of about the toll of that power.
Yeah, the crux of Poltergeist wasn't really so much the Poltergeist itself as much as it was the idea of something in your house slowly making you go mad.
Right. Also, The Exorcist, The Omen. I know it. Was that the 80s?
Exorcist, I think, was another one that was late 70s, but we can include it for the sake of the.
It's a 1973 film. That's my bad.
Okay. Rosemary's Baby, I thought, was the 80s, wasn't it?
Hold on. 1968.
Wow, I was way off.
Yeah, but again, our point being is you had so much. There was so much.
Yeah.
To pick from.
There was something for everybody.
Yeah.
You want your generic slasher movies? We got those. You want slasher movies with a little bit of a supernatural twist? We got those.
You know what's
movies that are a little bit self-aware and campy? We got those. You want serious dramas? We got those too.
Yeah. You know what's weird? You know what's weird? Like today, you get like this issue, like where people bring up like the characters were very stock and stuff, like
Mm-hmm.
And especially in like a lot of modern horror movies, you get like the stereotypical stereotypes, the stereotypes of horror.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue that the original in the 80s, the 80s horror actually had very complex, nuanced, interesting characters, mostly. Granted, again, like you could have obviously the stereotypes, because you don't have the stereotypes unless you actually made them during that time, but
yeah,
there were still
but in those times they were new and they were fresh and they were alive. the main issue with stereotypes later on is that by that point, any life, any energy that could have been gotten out of those tropes had been well and truly sucked out already, and it was like beating a dead horse. So much so that we got great parody movies like Cabin in the Woods.
Yeah. Scream as well, which was created by Wes Craven to parody his own horror films as well, which was cool.
Further props to Wes Craven. I mean, I'm in the habit of giving props to Wes Craven just as a general rule. He's awesome, but to have the balls to parody your own tropes is just epic.
Ironically, I think the Child's Play series, for the most part, kind of represented 80s horror overall because of how different each movie was. I mean, sure, you had your horror and you had comedy in there. And you classified most of them as horror comedies, but each one was very different to the former.
Mm-hmm.
And just you got the just difference in like monsters as well.
Incidentally, while we're on the subject of the Child's Play movies, fuck you, modern Chucky remake movie, because you took the supernatural element out of Chucky and made it boring. Fuck you and your stupid AI convenient bullshit.
Right, but back to what I was saying. The villains and the monsters in the horror movies were always interesting, and that's why they kind of became the faces of those franchises.
Yeah, I mean, to most horror fans, there are like two waves of monster movies. There's the classic Universal monsters, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, and then there is the 1980s sort of horror renaissance monsters. Yeah. Freddy, Chucky, Jason, Pinhead, and on it goes.
Yeah. And again, like the variety you would get, like sometimes you just get the mute silent shapes, like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or the Miner from My Bloody Valentine.
Yeah. Or you get the fast talking like trickster characters like Freddy or Chucky or the Leprechaun.
Yeah. Or you get like the sophisticated, refined, just Hannibal Lecter type of characters, specifically with like Pinhead and the Cenobites.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I like the rendition of Hell in those movies so much is because it's Hell as designed by a philosophy student, and I can speak from experience on that one because, like I said, if I ran the universe and could start creation over from scratch, and I needed to include a Hell in my universe, I'd basically be yanking the Hell from the Hellraiser franchise.
And just, I think from silhouette of the characters, you could tell who they were.
Yep. And what's more, the interesting thing about giving each of them their own style and their own voice is you can't take a line from Freddy and make it a Pinhead line. And you can't take a Pinhead line and make it a Freddy line. And
I think there are like one or two lines from Freddy that you can put into Pinhead, and there's one line I think Freddy could make work from Pinhead.
Do I look like a person who cares what God thinks line?
No. Will tear your soul apart. Like, I think that what some Freddy could say, and I believe
I don't think it would. I don't think it would have the same impact.
True. Okay. True. I don't disagree with you there. I was just saying, like, I think
it would still have an impact, but it wouldn't be and this is what I mean. Even if you were to take those same words, "I'll tear your soul apart," and give them to Freddy, the overall essence of the phrase would be completely different. With Pinhead, everything is clinical and precise and vaguely philosophical. With Freddy, it's snarky and occasionally angry.
I'd also say kind of chaotic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the man was, a child molester who decided to escape into dreams.
Was he ever
him being entirely sane?
Was he actually really like? Okay, let's just say we stick with the original. I don't think it was ever really proven that he was actually truly guilty.
Although, given how he spent his afterlife, I'm willing to.
There's actually a few theories on that, and I think it would be interesting to discuss that some other time. But
yeah, that'll have to be saved for a future Halloween rants.
Yeah, but again, our point being obviously is that unlike today, there was just this creative ocean that
perfect example of how modern day horror protagonists don't stack up in any way whatsoever to the horror Renaissance one. Let's take someone like the Slender Man, since he's probably the most. And let's take Fly-By Man.
Don.
Can you honestly tell me you can tell them apart?
Don, you cut out there for a sec.
Okay, god damn it! I'll reboot then pop back in.
Give them a sec, folks.
I have returned.
He's back. Okay, you started on Slender Man and then just kind of.
Okay, so to demonstrate what we mean by the lack of substance in modern day horror icons, let's take the Slender Man, probably the most modernized horror icon we have, and let's take the Bye-Bye Man. If you didn't know what those characters were called, do you honestly think you could tell them apart, like in terms of the lore? Or is it just vague supernatural entity comes out of the ether to get you because you did a stupid thing?
Ironically, I think
complete with jump scares and generic horror twists.
Ironically, I think the main issue again is that they don't actually have a clear idea on what they're doing with these characters. Because, and I've said this so many times before, there are no bad ideas, just poor execution.
Yeah. And honestly, probably the worst idea you could possibly ever come up with is just to not have an idea. Because in a lot of modern horror movies, you just see almost like movies made on autopilot. They're not making a movie because they have a really interesting idea of what to do with this character or that character, or a really good premise that they can pull from. It's just, we need to make a movie, therefore we will make this movie.
Ironically, I think the best, and it's not really saying much when I'm saying the best, but the best modern horror movies are kind of like ones from Jordan Peele or like Blumhouse for the most part, because
honestly, Jason Blum is probably as close as we're going to get to a modern like John Carpenter or.
Right. But I'm only saying that because there really hasn't been a bar that's been set in terms of modern horror, and the thing with most of those movies is they're meh. They're media.
Yeah. Blumhouse is essentially the modern version of Blue Moon Production. for anyone that doesn't know, back in the 80s and 90s, Blue Moon Productions was the go-to company if you wanted to make a direct-to-video genre movie, whether it's horror, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's whatever. And they ended up giving us honestly pretty great direct-to-video movies like the Witchcraft movies, of which there were like 13, or Puppet Master, which there were like 6 of.
Yeah.
But yeah, Blumhouse is kind of the modern day version of that. It makes very, very low budget, very, very B-movie horror movies work really, really well, but that's all they are. There's no blockbuster horror movies anymore. There's no new horror icons. There's no new Freddy's. There's no new Jasons. There's not a third generation of horror icons. First generation of movie horror icons are the Universal monsters. Second generation of movie horror icons are the 80s monsters. And the third generation of horror monsters is no fucking where to be found. None.
The thing is, I mean, you could make somewhat of an argument with creepypastas, but that's in terms of pop culture, not really in terms of movies.
That's not in movies or even necessarily in storytelling. That's the internet's adaptation of horror, which we'll be spending a lot of time talking about next week.
Yeah.
But in terms of like movies, where are the new urban legend makers? Where are the new horror icons? Where are the new things that keep you up at night when you watch a horror movie? The closest thing to that, I guess, would be like a Paranormal Activity movie, which are loosely based on actual events.
Well, I mean, what about Trick or Treat? With Sam.
Yeah, you could definitely make the argument with Sam, and I would definitely put him up there.
I'd say the Jeepers Creeper, like the Creeper from the Jeepers Creepers, but
yeah. Honestly, Sam was the last one that really grabbed people's attention. So much so that there's so much Trick or Treat merchandise that people who haven't even seen the movie know who Sam Hain is.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that he's called Sam Hain when that's the original name of the Celtic holiday that inspired Halloween is just genius. And thank you, Michael Dougherty, for just everything.
Right, but yeah, again, like the point obviously being is that here's the weird thing about like creepypastas. I think they could be interesting movies,
but you'd have to get somebody who loved and respected the, for lack of a better term, lore of the creepypasta.
Right, and I've listened to like readings of like creepypastas. Holy shit! Like one of those could be turned into a movie, and I think that'd be pretty good.
Honestly, I think the best way to go about it would be like almost like a Twilight Zone style horror anthology, because each of the creepypastas has kind of a quasi folkloric quality to it anyway that is reminiscent of like the Twilight Zone or Tales from the Dark Side or something like that.
Or better yet,
and also they're mostly short enough that you could fit 3 or 4 of them in an episode and it wouldn't make much of a difference.
Yeah. Or better yet, get the people who do like those short films based on creepypastas. Get them to do a movie.
Yep.
Again, we'll get more into this next week, but yeah, no, it's just like it's weird how there was like this just renaissance and resurgence of horror and it's kind of just died down and just kind of been lurking in the shadows, and not even in a fun, cool way that makes you pay attention to every dance in the dark.
Mm-hmm. And yet, there are still more horror movies being made every year than comic book movies. Just thought I'd throw that in there to piss off the comic book genre deniers.
Okay.
Yeah. Shall we move to the next topic?
I feel like we should skip the topic we were originally going to talk to because we don't really have a lot to talk about with that one, and just kind of go to the video because it's kind of long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, so give us one moment, folks.
Yeah. We're going back to the Renegade cut well.
Been a while. Okay. There we go. Yeah, this is from Renegade Cuts. Renegade Cut. Maniacs and Psychos, mental illness and horror movies. Dalton had sent me this earlier in the week, I believe on Wednesday. I have not watched the whole thing, and neither has Dalton, so we're kind of going in this blind with you guys.
Yeah. One has some kind of high hopes that this will be a good one because, believe it or not, Renegade Cut can make good content.
He can. It's just it's an interesting. I'd be willing to listen to the argument, but I'm more worried about the conclusions he comes to. Is the thing.
Yeah, and the as usual lack of self-awareness or outright self-contradiction.
Okay, so
these things happen way too often in the videos we do responses to, and they've happened quite often in videos that have been in response to Leon. So there's that.
All right, so this is 16 minutes and 48 seconds. So Jack-o'-lanterns.
Jack-o'-lantern.
In the 1960 film Psycho, after Marion Crane in the shower scene, after the private investigator falls down the stairs, after the light bulb and the body and all the other iconic scenes of the horror classic, the movie grinds to a complete halt. For 5.5 minutes,
Sorry, I just had to pause it, 20 seconds.
Yeah, because the MCA rules. Jack-o'-lanterns, let him finish the point, and then if there's anything to respond to,
Right. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Psychiatrist explains to the surviving characters, as well as the audience, what just happened. The psychiatrist explains the underlying psychological disorder relevant to the film, dissociative disorder, even though he never uses that term. Nor does he use the more antiquated term, multiple personality disorder. The psychiatrist fills in the blanks in case the audience could not figure out why Norman was doing what he was doing, and he delivers an unseen backstory that is not so much revealed as it is spilled all over the epilogue.
Okay, but even in Psycho, which was made in the 60s, there was at least an attempt to classify Norman's behavior. And honestly, in my opinion, having a crazy person do crazy things and not attempting to explain their behavior would be worse. Because number one, it gives people the impression that all types of craziness are the same, which they aren't. And number two, it honestly, I would argue, stigmatizes mental illness more not to try and explain it, or not to try and tie a character's symptoms to something, because it leaves the audience with the impression that this isn't a mental issue; it's a moral issue. Because people see slasher characters as evil, if you don't say something along the lines of they have a mental condition that makes them act this way, and here is the rationale for why they do so, you leave people with the impression that any kind of mental illness is just a character flaw or a moral failing rather than a mental. And there's a lot more sympathy for a mental failure than there is a moral one. Because people have control over their moral agency. They don't have control necessarily over their own minds. And generally speaking, when we see someone who doesn't have control over their own mental faculties, we're at the very least more sympathetic than we would be if they were just a sane quote unquote person with no discernible mental issues who just acted like an asshole because they wanted to.
Right, I'll get more into it when
that makes them more copable. If you have the option of not being a crazy fuck, and you choose to be a crazy fuck anyway, that makes you more morally culpable, and that makes you more hateable from an audience perspective. Whereas if you have a mental disorder, then the ball of sympathy is more likely to be in your court because you can't help the way you're acting. And contrary to popular belief, human beings have an innate sense of vulnerability and fairness and sympathy. We don't like bullying vulnerable people. That's why one of the easiest ways to make a protagonist is to make an underdog protagonist. Because people like to see a underdog beat the odds. And people find villains who have an underdog persona or a victimized persona more tragic than malevolent. Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I was just gonna say, like, I don't have anything else to say to this and Don, you are going to crucify me for this, but I have not seen Psycho.
Okay, where's the Clockwork Orange share? I need the Ludovico technique here with Psycho.
Well, mainly, I just haven't seen it because it never really gripped me. Like, it never really interested me.
Yeah, by modern standards, it's a very slow burn.
It's not even that. It's just, I don't know. Nothing really about it stood out to me. Like, I know what happens. Obviously, I'm not stupid, but
yeah. I mean, even people who haven't seen Psycho at this point at least know something about Psycho if they're even remotely interested in it.
Yeah. Though to be fair, although I am a fan of Alfred Hitchcock, mainly as a director. He does bring up the fact, it's put right at the end. Like, if he was going to make an argument on, like, the issues with Psycho, that's it. Like, the fact that you couldn't have been able to put this discussion in any other way, I think, yeah, that's an issue. That is a problem, like a legitimate complaint. But he's kind of.
I mean, there is the old film standby of show don't tell.
Right.
But
I can understand why it's in there. I'm just saying, like,
Mhm.
I am willing to overlook it because of the rest of the film.
and again, I feel like it's better to have it there than not there, because if it hadn't been there, I honestly and sadly, in the absence of any kind of exposition like that in movies, I could genuinely see a world where people with mental illnesses were treated like they're immoral people rather than people who are sick with an illness. That, I think, one of the pressing issues of our day and age is we do need to stop treating mental illnesses like they're moral failings as and when we can, because they're illnesses. I mean, you don't say someone is immoral because they have a cold or something. So, if anything else, we should start treating mental illnesses like we treat other kinds. And it gets a little bit ambiguous when you have people whose mental illness literally makes them do immoral shit like killing people, because at that point what we're vilifying is not the illness itself but your actions. Like, nobody is going to sit there and defend Ted Kaczynski because he had severe asocial tendencies. He's not accountable to building bombs and blowing people up for abstract philosophical reasons. But on some level, I think we need to remind ourselves occasionally that mental illness is an illness and not a moral failing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Like, I don't really have much to say to this because I'm kind of saving everything from when he actually gets something I actually know of. So. I thought I was gonna sneeze. Damn it. All right. Right.
Yep. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
Psychiatrist also goes out of his way to alleviate any panicking heterosexuals by saying there is nothing more to Norman dressing up as a woman than wanting to give his mother life. This scene receives the most criticism out of anything in the film because these details and explanations could have arrived more naturally within the bulk of the narrative instead of tacked on in this epilogue. In an otherwise excellent movie and one of the all-time greats, Psycho concludes with this clumsy, awkward exposition after the fact. But then again, horror often portrays mental illness and mental health clumsily and awkwardly.
Okay, overall, he's not wrong about Psycho making the mistake of just having the entire movie prior to the epilogue explained. Again,
Yeah,
I don't.
It could have been handled better, and he's right in the sense that often horror movies do handle mental illness kind of weird and awkwardly.
Well, to be fair, that's all media. To be fair,
yeah. Unless the story is literally about mental illness, like a character study, for example. But then again, sometimes with movies like that, you'll get people going, "You're making this too sympathetic. How dare you say that bad people occasionally have reasons for doing what they do?"
Oh, so Joker then. I knew you were going to bring it up.
It was inevitable because I can almost guarantee he's going to spend most of this video saying something along the lines of, "We need to be more sympathetic to people with mental illnesses," and that is objectively true. I'm not disputing that.
No, yeah.
But it strikes me that he is also the kind of person who would burn Todd Phillips in effigy because he made the Joker too much of a sympathetic, well-realized character. And yeah, just the sheer hypocrisy about this, because like mental illnesses are definitely something we need to handle better as a civilization. I am definitely not disputing that. However, in addition to handling mental illness better, far be it from me to go all men's rights advocate here, but maybe coming up with terms like incel and fuck and various other terms for you're an invalid human because you don't have a vibrant enough sex life is not helping. Like the same people who will rail to the blue in the face about how we need to be more sympathetic to people with mental illness will say that Joker is setting a bad example for people, or that toxic masculinity is a thing. And yet never so much is mentioned toxic femininity. But that's neither here nor there. So I just the sheer cognitive dissonance of it all boggles my mind. It's like out of one side of their face, we need to be more sympathetic to these people. Out of the other side of their face, if you have even the micro bit of sympathy for these people and treat them like victims and human beings, then you are a horrible, horrible person and enabling them. So yeah, I'm anticipating a lot of cognitive dissonance here ahead of time. Maybe he'll avoid it. Maybe he'll manage to. Maybe he was one of the people who saw Joker as more of a analogy for civil unrest, and therefore he'll be more sympathetic to Arthur as a character if he ever brings up Joker. I don't think he'll bring up Joker specifically in this movie. It's just a really great counterexample to a lot of this accept mental illness on the face of it ideas. You know, if you truly believe that we need to be more sympathetic to people with mental illnesses, then why do so many people in the media see Arthur Fleck's Joker as the Arthur Fleck's version of the Joker as the devil?
Right.
And why
Dalton,
masculinity a thing?
You good?
Yeah.
Okay. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Moving on. Jack-o'-lantern.
The fiction of horror movies often reflect both real-world fears of and real-world ignorance about mental illness. These portrayals then further solidify these fears and this ignorance in the popular consciousness.
Sorry, just he's not done.
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, he's not done. I need to pause it.
Okay.
So
that is an extremely extraordinary claim there, because I can think of a lot of horror movies that straight up go out of their way to say this person isn't a particular category of mental ill. Like an example that just pisses me off every time I hear it. Some people claim that Silence of the Lambs is transphobic because Buffalo Bill is meant to be transgendered.
wait, didn't we already talk about this at one point?
We may have. But in the movie itself, there's literally a scene where Clarice and Dr. Lecter go back and forth explaining in great detail why Buffalo Bill isn't transgender and why he is mistakenly under the apprehension that he is, and that his pathology is worse than the trans. So yeah, maybe he won't reference that particular example either. It seems odd to me to say that horror movies, as a general rule, vilify or misrepresent mental illness when there are plenty of examples to the contrary that are specifically made to be examples to the contrary. And it seems like he wants to vilify horror movies and this is just the straw that he grabbed onto.
Right. So for time's sake, we will have to cut this halfway through. Just there's not that need to be said because it is about 17 minutes long.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, jack-o'-lantern.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
A kind of Ouroboros of misinformation in which the audience does not know whether it is influencing these films or the films are influencing the audience. Let's close our eyes and think of words like psycho and maniac and let these images flood our minds. Now let's open our eyes. There's a good chance that many of us thought of something like this. Even if we have no conscious disdain for the mentally ill, we are not immune to the propaganda of popular culture.
Okay. For the record, what he was showing prior, Dawn, because I know you can't see it, is he was showing American Psycho with Christian Bale, My Bloody Valentine, and some other things I'm not entirely sure of. But for one thing, American Psycho it's honestly a trip. It's like one of the trippiest movies out there.
Yeah, it's major head fuck.
Yeah, mainly I just think the guy is fucking losing it because of all the pressure the guy finds himself in.
I honestly don't know where I would place Patrick Bateman in terms of this, but okay.
But
here's the thing, Leon. Not every mentally ill person fits the term psycho or maniac, because the word psycho comes from the word psychotic, which basically means delusional, like violently or extremely delusional to the point that the person can no longer distinguish the boundaries of fantasy and reality. And maniac comes from mania, which is like a unnatural state of euphoria. So just because psychotics and maniacs are portrayed in a certain way does not mean that you can then extrapolate that out to every kind of mental illness, because there are plenty of mental illnesses that never outwardly affect a person's behavior and mostly make them suffer internally. And what's more, especially in the modern era where we have a much more widespread diagnosis for things like depression and anxiety, I think most people understand that there's a difference between extreme violent mental illness and average run-of-the-mill everyday mental illness, and that there's a gradient of gray areas in between, either extreme. You have your garden variety depressives and manic depressives and anxious people, and then at the far other end you've got your Jeffrey Dahmers, your Ted Kaczynski's, and so on. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got everybody else. But point being, in a world where mental illnesses tend to be this common, is it really up to movies to draw a distinction, especially when the audience themselves is perfectly capable of drawing the distinction, and the movies themselves weren't even discussing mental illness writ large? They were discussing particular strains of mental illness that are amenable to the subject matter of a horror movie. Because, okay, nobody wants their serial killer character to just have garden variety anxiety. That doesn't actually tell us anything about the character's mind or why the character does what the character does. The reason why in horror movies you see more extreme variants of mental illness, like extreme psychotic episodes or, violent mania, is because those are the kinds of people you find in horrific situations. Yeah. Because, you see, horrific situations aren't caused by generic anxiety or depression. They're caused by severe breakings with, reality and or logic. Therefore, if you want a person in a horror movie to possess a mental illness, it probably needs to be the kind of extreme mental illness that would cause a horrific type situation. It's simple. It's really, really simple logic.
Right.
If you want a crazy person to be your horror movie villain, they need to be crazy enough that their crazy offers some stakes to the horror movie in question. Moving forward, Jack-o'-lantern.
Well, I wanted to bring up the fact that he says that these movies are propaganda.
Yeah, that requires a statement of intention or a assumption of intention that simply isn't there.
Yeah,
So yeah, biased as fuck, Leon. You're assuming most.
That shit. Don't. Yeah, I can't hear you. Give us a sec, people. Hello, Dalton.
Hi.
Okay. We lost you around when you're talking about propaganda.
Oh yeah. The word propaganda implies a intention that simply isn't there to be found in the raw evidence of the movie. Leon, you're essentially assuming that you can read the motives or intentions of the filmmaker better than they can. And yeah, no. And what's worse is you're only doing it because of some preconceived idea of how those people think, rather than actually asking them or getting any anecdotes to support your theory. You're just assuming that they think the way you think they think because that's what your film as seen through the lens of sociology class taught you, or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
You're interpreting something and then assuming that your interpretation validates itself with no deference towards the actual material. And then you're sampling any evidence that would confirm your supposition and completely distorting it to fit your model. It's lazy and intellectually dishonest is the fundamental issue there. Anyway, moving on. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Right. Jack. Oh.
Sure. Psycho comes from the psychological term psychopathy, and maniac comes from mania, a term closely associated, although not always, with bipolar disorder. Despite manic episodes generally being non-violent and individuals with bipolar disorder also being non-violent, maniac is nonetheless a pejorative phrase used to describe a violent, presumably mentally ill individual. So much so that there is a series of horror films called Maniac.
Okay, but there's, I don't know, like, it feels like you're kind of reaching on the fact that the term itself, I don't think really applies in the situations of that, because it really, again, like, it's a case by case thing for the terms.
Yeah, there are different kinds of mania is the thing. Yes, it's somewhat sloppy to use the same term for multiple different mentalities, but it's because those mentalities have a common thread. In the case of the violent maniac, what makes them manic, what makes them hyper active and hyper energy is whatever violent stimulus they can get. In actual clinical terms, that I'm gonna actually make use of something that I discovered recently by watching a guy by the name of Sam Baknin on the YouTubes. There's something called sadistic supply for people who have sadistic tendencies of the kind that you might see in a maniac in like the classical Hollywood sense, which is essentially when a person is sadistic, they get pleasure out of causing pain, and they go and seek ways of causing other people pain so that they can feel the elation of having caused pain, hence the term sadistic supply. That doesn't mean that every person with bipolar disorder experiences a similar elation, because their mania is a brain chemistry issue primarily and not tied to a particular kind of stimulus. Whereas a maniac that Hollywood might find useful in a horror movie setting is the kind of maniac that has the, tether to sadistic supply. Yeah, that it's different sources for the same mental condition. The condition being, hyperactivity and joy.
Yeah.
Moving forward, Jack-o'-lanterns.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
The 1986 short film Maniac 2, Mr. Robbie, is actually a remake of The Psychopath. In other words, these terms are used interchangeably and often to the detriment of those suffering from mental illness. According to John Goodman, author of The Horror of Stigma, horror films will often include stigmatizing representations of psychosis and mental health care environments. Misinformation is often communicated. Due to these stigmatizing representations, people experiencing mental ill health may be rejected by the public.
Okay.
They're used relatively interchangeably because, number one, it's an informal context, and number two, people with psychopathy are Okay, how to phrase it? People with violent psychopathy tend to also have what are called comorbidities, which is essentially if you have one type of mental illness, it can make you more susceptible or more likely to have a mentality that can be expressed through other mental illness. In short, people with violent psychopathy are more likely to be manically sadistic or to gain pleasure from inflicting pain on other people. That's generally speaking why you see people who are thought to be psychopaths also have, manically sadistic tendencies. It's not because the person in question is necessarily ignorant, although that is very often the case, but because people who have violent psychopathy also can tend to have sadistic manic tendencies, and therefore making them a more interesting and compelling villain. And once again, just because the same word is used does not mean the same thing is implied, which is to say that just because a sadistic manic person might derive pleasure from causing people pain. That doesn't mean that everyone who sees a bipolar person on the street automatically goes, they're going to stab me with a, bread knife or something. Because people understand, at least on some level, that there's a gradient of mental health issues from, your garden variety depression or anxiety to, your psychotic schizophrenic or your manically sadistic psychopath. And the reason why we see more manically sadistic psychopaths and schizophrenics in these kind of movies is because these are horror movies. Therefore, if you want a character to be your main villain in a movie and you want them to have mental illness, it's a better idea to show a kind of mental illness that could contribute to their violent tendencies, rather than just, a person who's generically depressed. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Jack. Jack-o'-lanterns.
In addition to being rejected, those with mental illness may choose not to seek help for fear of this rejection or out of personal shame. In other words, because of this stigma, mental illness can go untreated, causing greater unnecessary suffering. Popular media has the ability to inform and educate the public consciousness. Accepting this, popular media must also be acknowledged as having the ability to misinform and miseducate the public. Horror naturally has us identify with the victims of these maniacs and psychos.
Okay.
Yes, because they are doing horrible things. Regardless of their mental state, they are doing horrible things. And it's the doing of horrible things that people find objection. Now, you could make the argument that because a lot of these horror movie antagonists have mental illnesses that contribute to why they do what they do, that some people in the audience might conflate anyone with those mental disorders to do those kinds of things. But given that it's the most extreme cases of mental illness that are on display in horror movies, and often exaggerated even beyond natural terms, I don't think anyone is going to see someone with depression or even psychopathic tendencies and go, you must chop up babies in your spare time or something. And in fact, the funny thing about narcissists, psychopaths, and the like is they're very, very good at convincing people that there's nothing wrong with them. Many, many a time you'll see a person interviewed about their neighbor being a serial killer or their son being a serial killer or something, and they'll say, I had no idea he was so polite and so charming and so convincing. Because one of the things that psychopathy does is because your brain is not processing emotions properly, it makes you hyper-focus on body language and expression in the same way that very often autistic people, because they're not good at reading social cues, will become hyper-observant to compensate for the fact that they can't understand social. In addition, psychopaths, narcissists, and sociopaths and the like have what's referred to as cold empathy, which essentially means they're very, very good at reading people, specifically in cases where reading people will get them what they want. Which essentially means that the psychopaths you have to watch out for are the ones you wouldn't notice overtly. The poor autistic bastard with no social graces is not a threat. The charming psychopath who is so good at his job that you wouldn't be able to tell that he was a psychopath is the threat. And if nothing else, horror movies are very, very good at demonstrating that principle.
Right. And also, I think he's kind of implying that the audience is dumb enough to assume.
There's some extreme elitism going on of the idea of, the audience is too stupid to read between the lines or offer any, rational mitigation of, they'll just take what the movie tells them as gospel and never and never apply any critical thinking or reasoning to it.
The weird thing is, if I agree with him, if I agreed with his points, I'd be rooting for the killers, because most of the time I do not like the quote unquote protagonist, because most of the time they're dumbasses for getting their asses caught in those situations.
Yes, horror movie protagonists are notoriously stupid, and very often the horror movie antagonists will be geniuses and very high functioning. So naturally, a lot of the time, we relate more to characters like Dr. Hannibal Lecter or the Jigsaw Killer than we do their victim. Like for example, in Silence of the Lambs, the antagonist to Dr. Lecter is Dr. Frederick Chilton. And he is the most detestable, narcissistic, bleeding asshole you could ever conceivably imagine in a movie. So when Dr. Lecter gets out and has an old friend for dinner, his words, not mine, honestly, I'm rooting for Lecter in that scenario because Chilton is an asshole. And people in their lives, people often in their lives can sympathize with that because we all know asshole authority figures. We all know people who abuse their position of power or their position of influence to be cantankerous jackasses. And we like to believe that we are, the put upon ones in that situation. So when somebody like Dr. Lecter, who for all of his, cannibalistic and, serial killing ways, is an extremely erudite, extremely polite, extremely, for lack of a better term, moral person, when we see him, who's been victimized by Chilton, presumably for the 8 years he's been in the asylum, get his own back by eating Chilton's face off, we're rooting for Lecter, because Lecter has, at the very least, been shown that he has a code of ethics, whereas Chilton is a detestable asshole with no sense of humanity or empathy whatsoever at all.
Right,
and therefore deserves to be eaten by the logic of the movie.
Right, and also and I'm using air quotes by the way, the maniacs and psychos, as you define them, are often more entertaining just because they kind of don't give a shit about normal social norms. They exist within their own world. Therefore, they do whatever they want.
They're free, and very often they're within their own context, all powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And people like the idea of being able to say fuck the system. That's why villains are so often more compelling and interesting than their heroes, because their motivations make more sense to us. Because you can say, I don't want to ever do anything bad because of abstract moral reasons, but if you don't write a paragon very, very well, you're going to make them look like robotic sticks in the mud. Whereas we all understand about anger, we all understand about envy, we all understand about rage and self-interest and ambition. And those qualities are very often expressed more often by the villain. And we also like the notion that we're the smartest person in the room. Or we like at least being on the side of the smartest person in the room. Because intelligence is a power that people either have and want to have validated or not. And therefore can empathize with the, charismatic super geniuses like Dr. Lecter or the Jigsaw Killer, or even somebody like Mr. Glass from The Unbreakable, even though that's not quite a horror movie.
Right.
You get my point.
Yeah.
Jack-o'-lantern.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
Which creates the intended framing of the perpetrator as the other. And if this other is portrayed as mentally ill, this in turn frames the mentally ill as dangerous. Fictional narratives may not have an obligation to be accurate, but their messaging and stigmatization is nonetheless effective. These inaccuracies can present falsehoods and encourage stigmatization of the mentally ill. The real
Okay, so
Again, very often the thing that turns people off to villains in these kind of movies is not their personality or even necessarily their mental illness. These things we can often find charismatic, charming, and even to some extent inspiring.
I mean, that's how you got
It's their actions that we end up finding objectionable. Sorry, you were saying something, right?
I mean, I was gonna say that's how you kind of get cults and stuff.
Yeah. And how even in real life there are subcultures that venerate serial killers. There's the murderabilia subculture in antique collecting. It's fucking weird. Basically, people like the idea of owning objects that were once owned by serial killers and madmen.
What the fuck?
Yeah. Like one of Ted Kaczynski's typewriters sold for like more than $1 million once.
Yeah, but
I pulled the Ted Kaczynski example because of all of the mad people in the world. Ted Kaczynski, I can kind of like. It's a weird feeling when you can kind of see a mad, insane person's point, but just because the Unabomber was a mad genius didn't mean he wasn't a genius.
okay.
Anyway, jack-o'-lanterns.
I mean, I was gonna say that he's using footage. He used footage from a movie called Maniac Cop, which, if I remember, well, it did have a social comedy on like police brutality and stuff, which came out around, I believe, the 80s or 90s. I know it had Bruce Campbell in it.
Yeah.
But again, my main thing is that it's just, I don't think it's, the term maniac in the title isn't referring to a mental illness. It's more referring to the more just violent destructiveness that the cop is doing.
It's describing his behavior in an informal way. It's not even making a commentary on his mental status.
Yeah. And again, like, I really don't get why he's constantly like doing the whole, the audience will just see it this way and just have this big bias and stigmatization against people with mental illnesses.
Yeah. On the one hand, it's being very condescending and elitist towards the average person's intelligence, and on the other hand, it even assumes the route their minds will take in the absence of whatever intelligence he thinks he has. And once again, it's projecting motives and interpretations onto people, and then assuming that your extrapolations are so unassailable that they're essentially a fact of life.
I think that's why he
is
is
right, and he assumes he's so right that nobody could possibly present a counter argument.
It kind of explains the 17-minute video.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Jack-o'-lanterns?
Jack-o'-lanterns.
These inaccuracies can present falsehoods and encourage stigmatization of the mentally ill. The real-world stigma surrounding mental illness can be seen played out in the fiction of horror movies, and this can be interrogated through these portrayals. Here are many, many examples. In the aforementioned film Psycho, the title alone tells us a lot about how the popular consciousness uses mental illness as shorthand for danger.
again, psycho isn't referring to all people with mental illnesses. It is referring to the specific subset of those people who, in their breaking with their ability to process logic and reality, become violent or delusional to a harmful degree. And the main reason why that is the kind of psycho that it's focused on in both the book Psycho is based on and the movie is because those are the kind of psychos that are risky enough to star in horror movies and horror books, and compelling enough to be characters in stories in general. Because people go to stories for extremes, especially extremes that they either can't, for their own safety, be exposed to in actuality, or aren't going to be because of the restrictions of the world. And generally speaking, the kind of psychopaths and sociopaths that you see in movies are the types you want to avoid because they have a tendency to abuse everyone they're exposed to. Either by doing direct harm to them or by simply psychologically abusing them. So, yes, saying that you should avoid people on that much of an extreme mental health spectrum is probably good advice.
Also, I think it's just referring to the single psycho, which is Norman Bates.
Or alternatively, his mother who abused him so badly that it literally fucked up his mind.
Yeah.
That's another one of those cases where, is the monster of Frankenstein the villain, or is the doctor that made him the villain?
It's the doctor.
And in the same way, you could make the argument with Psycho. Who is the real Psycho? The abused child who got so addicted to his mother that he propped up her corpse, or the mother that did the abusing in the first place?
The mother.
Yeah, I honestly, at that point, I would blame the mother. That doesn't mean that Norman isn't, responsible for what he did.
He is. I think you could just have... Norman is responsible for his actions.
Yeah, but at the same time, he only commits those kind of actions when he's in the persona of his mother, which he has because of how his mother treated him when she was actually alive.
I would say the mother is the monster, and Norman is the victim that acts out in spirit of the monster.
Well, I mean, that's the other tragic thing about a lot of people with severe mental illnesses. The way mental illness often propagates itself is because if you're raised by someone with a particular mental health issue, you will learn to have similar mental health issues in response to that. Like if your mother is, violently abusive, and that's how she expresses her quote unquote love, then you as a child are going to learn love is equivalent to violent abuse. And then when you love other things, in air quotes, you're going to violently abuse them because that's all you understand about how human beings work.
Yep.
It's a sad cycle, but monsters create other monsters. That's the long and the short of it.
Yep.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
I'm depressed now.
How come?
Everything that just happened.
What?
Everything that was just said,
Oh, the sad fact about how most people with severe mental health issues attained it through being abused by other people with mental health issues.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Jack
The
O'Lanterns.
world is occasionally a fucked up place, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, Jack O'Lanterns.
Mm-hmm.
This is a horror film, and it only requires one word to let the audience know what genre it is. A movie called Psycho is not going to be a drama or a comedy because we have been conditioned to believe mental illness is a source of horror, that the mentally ill themselves are inherently dangerous. Crazy people who are lurking in the shadows with no motivation needed in their broken minds.
She just goes, could it possibly be that the movie was marketed as a horror movie? Because it could have easily been a drama. There are plenty of dramas that contain the word psycho in them. There's plenty of overlap between horror and drama as well. I mean, do we even need to bring up the, forever traumatized nature of the Lifetime movie channel? Almost every Lifetime movie is about what would pass for a horror movie if it were on any other network.
Yeah, those. I never got Lifetime. Like,
the only reason I know about it is because my mom is a really big fan of.
no. I mean, like, I never got why they did those kind of movies, man. They're just.
Yeah, those movies will fuck you up, but good if you're not careful.
And actually, Family Guy did a funny parody of it, where they talk about the movie where it's the Lifetime. It's a Lifetime movie, and men are terrible.
Honestly, yeah. Most of the Lifetime movie channel movies have a very female centric view of the world. It's very rare. It's very rare for a male to ever be the protagonist of those movies. And if a man looks like he's charming and likable in the first act of the movie,
most likely he's a rapist.
Yeah, expect him to be a sociopath in the second act of the movie and be cartoonishly evil by the third act. That's how Lifetime movies work. It's almost like if feminists and traditionalists could agree on anything, the movies they would make would be Lifetime movie.
Now I'm just even more depressed.
Yeah, well, at least it's only talking about Lifetime movies. At least you don't actually have to watch any of them.
True. Okay. Jacqueline?
Jack-o'-lanterns.
A little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
As the Psycho film series progresses, Norman Bates' characterization changes. In Psycho 2, Bates is released from a mental institution, having successfully pled insanity over 20 years prior. Bates reintegrates into society, earning employment and some form of social life. Throughout the film, Bates believes that whatever treatment he received during his institutionalization may not have been effective, as he begins to hear a familiar voice urging him to regress. In truth, he is being gaslighted by the family of one of his victims who believes that Bates is incapable of rejoining society safely.
Okay.
Well, what do you know? A movie where the psycho is the protagonist. That thing that you literally just got through saying almost never happens, and then you provided an example of, Leon. Like, honestly, like I don't understand how can these people continue to believe these things that they believe when they literally bring up counter arguments to their own suppositions.
It's like, I don't know. It's weird because the story just comes across as somewhat like, I get an idea that the theme, at least for like the antagonist, where it's one of the victims, is believing that no one can change. especially Norm. Obviously, especially Norman Bates.
Well,
But
I don't know if they would think that no one can change, but
well, I think if you're
when-
supposed to do generalization, obviously,
Mhm.
there's that. But I mean, specifically, obviously, I'm speaking like a person who's done bad things cannot change.
Yeah.
I think it would be the more accurate description.
Mhm. Well, maybe being a tiny bit more charitable and say when someone has done something that bad, they can't change.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair.
Which I guess is more fair than otherwise, but if you had just left him alone, person who is the antagonist of Psycho 2, he wouldn't be a problem anymore.
Mm.
And if anything, this just goes to prove the thing I was talking about earlier, where abuse and mental illness perpetuate themselves. Because she hated him so much, she brought back the monster that she was afraid would come back, rather than just doing the rational thing and leaving him the fuck alone. And then, waiting to say the inevitable "I told you so" if he does regress on his own.
Yeah, it's kind of like Laurie in 2018's Halloween, like Laurie Strode,
Mm-hmm.
where I believe it is said that she, like, at least it's theorized that she was responsible for getting Michael out and like setting him free so she could kill him.
Which, like, or leave him the fuck alone and move on with your life.
Yeah,
Anyway, Jack-o'-lantern.
Jack-o'-lantern.
And since he is no
That
longer
is
in
just
he has
legal
as much of a
hocus
right to
pocus.
his own life
And when
as
he
you and I.
murders again, you will be directly responsible.
This melodrama is nonetheless a fairly accurate microcosm of much of society's view of the mentally ill, that they are incurable, ultimately dangerous, and not worthy of the same rights and privileges afforded to the rest of us.
Okay,
I don't know what civilization you are living in, sir, but in the modern era in particular, I think everyone, at least at some point in their lives, deals with depression, anxiety, stress, OCD, some variation on what we would call mental illness.
hello.
If there's ever been a time where people have been more susceptible to sympathy for mental health issues, I don't know what it is. I mean, in the past, you would literally have people locked in sanitariums that were basically jails. And, in Shakespeare's time, the closest thing to a mental health hospital they had was literally a prison from which we get the word bedlam, because the mental health asylum in London was Bethlehem Hospital, and it was called Bedlam by the inmates, who were essentially tortured.
Yeah.
I mean, we've come a hell of a long way since the time where people would be literally lobotomized because doctors just didn't want to deal with them. So I don't know where you're
Not to mention,
getting this idea of everything is so bad for mentally ill people.
right? Not to mention anyone who went against the norm, the quote unquote norms of the times, were also thrown in as mentally ill.
Yeah, you were called mentally ill if you had an idea that went against the grain, even if you were entirely in possession of your faculties while you were doing it.
Yeah. Not to mention
because you must be invalid and wrong, because otherwise we would have to reevaluate our position, and that can never happen.
Right. At least today, they're at least given enough comfort and stuff and better care. Like there are people take courses to learn how to do these jobs to be able to take care of people who actually have these kind of issues.
Yeah, not to mention in modern, court cases, not guilty by reason of insanity is a thing. So instead of being locked up in a jail because you literally did do something that may or may not be worthy of being, in jail for, you're just as likely, if you have the right pathology, to go to a mental hospital instead.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean we still don't have, just because things are looking up for people with mental health issues now doesn't mean we don't still have work to do. But comparatively, if your position is society at large is hostile to people with mental health issues, as compared to what? Because compared to almost every other era in human history, we're pretty sympathetic towards them. And again, most people deal with minor mental health issues at least once in their lives. And several people who deal with mental health issues in their lives deal with it on a recurring basis, whether it's bipolar, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety, whether it's OCD, what have you. Most people are either aware of people with mental health issues or struggle with them themselves. So we're probably the most sympathetic we're ever going to get, barring some unforeseen circumstance.
Right. And I think it's mainly on the fact that Norman Bates has killed a bunch of people was the thing. Not the fact that he's insane.
Yeah.
More on the fact that he's killed people.
It's less about his mental health or his pathology and more about what actions that pathology led to.
Yeah.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
This may seem like an exaggeration of society's view, as one would rarely hear someone confess to that specific criteria and belief, but much in the same way that someone does not explicitly confess to being a racist, their attitudes, language, and smaller aggressions betray their worldview.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
I cannot believe, I genuinely cannot believe that he went from there to there.
That is 6 minutes in. 6 minutes in, and he brings that shit in.
Leon, my friend, you do not get to project your extrapolations of someone's worldview or intentions onto them, and then use your own extrapolations of that behavior as evidence that the person is secretly harboring a worldview that they categorically do not harbor. If someone says they're not racist, you can't just play philosophical, what the fuck is the game? The game with the cups and the ball where you...
Beer pong?
No, it's like 3-card Monty, but with you hide a ball under cups and then you make the person choose which cup the ball is under. A shell game. You can't play this kind of philosophical shell game where you get to expand and redefine the word racism beyond all reckoning, and then conflate your newly expanded definition with the classical definition and morally grandstand over people in that way. If you change what the word racism means and its implications, then you can't default back to the original definition and still and profit from the stigma of the original definition. For one thing, in a world where racism were as widespread and institutional as your worldview claims, Leon, no one would be ashamed of it. And for another, there are people, like Richard Spencer, for example, who willingly will admit to being racist. And but the thing is, the thing that utterly fucks your point in this regard, people like Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin and the like are either hated with a virulent passion or mocked mercilessly because they are essentially cartoon supervillains come to life. And in a world where anyone who overtly admits to being racist is mocked as a cartoon character or vilified as a hateful person, how can you honestly say that the broadened and diluted version of racism that you conflate with that is a serious problem? If the only kinds of racism that are permissible are so subtle and so non-consequential that you have to redefine the word racism to get them to stick, then either your version of racism isn't bad, or you need to stop playing with the fucking definition and realize that the only people who are actually racist are people like Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin, and those people are mocked mercilessly because they're evil cunts and cartoonish morons. But regardless of this, none of this has anything to do with mental health issues or how said mental health issues are portrayed in horror movies. Nothing. Unless you are so preoccupied with this issue that you feel the need to bring it into subject matters that it has nothing to do with, no matter how forced and ham-fisted you have to be about it. Which says, honestly, more about you, Leon, than anyone else's secretly held intentions or subconscious beliefs.
As has
You're teetering on the edge of original sin here. That's basically what microaggressions and unconscious bias amount to. It's you're bad and you're wrong, even if you don't know you're bad and you're wrong because we say so, and you can't defend yourself from it. Anyway, moving forward.
As a Hispanic, I agree with what the white man said.
I appreciate that. And before you go, he's a white person, therefore you have internalized racism or something, Leon. I also happen to be physically disabled and a religious minority, so you can go fuck yourself. Also gay, or bisexual, but that's not here in a minute. So if you want to play the game of identity politics strip poker, I've got at least 3 cards and Brainstormer has a few, so good luck.
I'm a living melting pot.
Basically.
Yeah.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
Psycho 2 is far more sympathetic to Bates than the original film, but this sympathy for the mentally ill becomes muddled in the final scenes. Bates once again murders a woman who may or may not be his actual biological mother, and he uses her as his alter ego, repeating the cycle he began many years prior. This ending suggests that Bates is incurable and that everything leading up to this moment of the film about his reformation can be dismissed.
No! It's a sign that when pushed to regress by people who actively want to harm him, like the woman you were describing, anyone can break. And if you're already psychologically fragile, if you're in the process of healing, it's easier to regress. The fatalism that you are seeing here, Leon, is entirely a fabrication of your own mind. there are entirely other interpretations for this ending that are neither fatalistic nor even necessarily cynical. If anything, it just goes to show that people who are victimized can in turn become abusers, because that's exactly what the woman in Psycho 2 does. At least from your description of the movie. I'm gonna level with you. I didn't even know there was Psycho 2, or you just brought it up. Now I need to go and watch it. But that's neither here nor there.
Right. So I think we are gonna have to call it, man, because I've been trying not to pass out the last like 10 minutes.
Brainstormer needs sleep, and I need to give my brain a rest from the sheer stupidity of this
show
video for a while. So.
Yeah, hopefully next week. Yeah, hopefully next week we'll be able to finish this. So yeah, with that, folks, I want to say goodbye, adios, aloha, auf Wiedersehen, sayonara, peace, cheers, and
shalom. Mental health is not unnecessarily vilified, and fuck off.